From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Meche breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
The 2024 NFL Draft has finally come to a close, and we now know where everyone went in the NFL Draft. Quite a few guys that went higher than we expected, quite a few guys that went lower than maybe we expected, but then there was also quite a bit of guys that had went about where we expected, but there was also quite a few shockers that had happened. I'm looking at you, Atlanta. Welcome back to another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. I'm your host, James Meche, the podcast where we talk about everything of what's going on in the NFL and the NBA. Of course, the NBA is going on right now with the first round of the playoffs, and at the time of this recording, quite a few teams have already moved on to the second round. We'll be looking at that in next week's edition of the podcast, but for right now, I want to look at what had happened in last week's 2024 NFL Draft that had happened live in Detroit. Now, of course, we know what had happened with the first few picks wasn't too much of a shocker, I guess you could say. Of course, Caleb Williams, he went number one overall to the Chicago Bears. I know that there was a little bit of a debate, especially last minute, when it comes to what were the Washington Commanders going to do. We knew that they weren't going to trade out. I mean, they were going to get their quarterback of the future. But was it going to be Jaden Daniels or was it going to be Drake May? Well, they went with Jaden Daniels, the Heisman Trophy winner out of LSU. To me, that wasn't a shocker. I was there with him going number two overall the whole way through. I felt like it was a little bit interesting that they were making it such a discussion, and I get it. People always want to talk about, well, there's always a scenario where it could play out this way, or it could play out this way instead of maybe the expected scenario. Well, for the most part, a lot of people had seen Jaden Daniels going number two overall, and to me, it just made the most sense. I know that a lot of people had Caleb Williams as the number one overall prospect and the number one quarterback in this draft, so of course, he's going to go number one overall. But to me, it had to be Jaden Daniels at number two, because to me, I think he had a very good case to be number one overall. He should have been number one overall if Caleb Williams wasn't going to be in this class, so if that's going to be the case, you default him to number two. Drake May. Some people, for him potentially going number two, they also had him going outside of number three and falling to maybe 6, maybe 7, maybe even outside of the top 10 of the draft. Well, he still ends up going to New England at number 3. There was a lot of debate for the Cardinals and for the Los Angeles Chargers, of were they going to be able to trade out? Were they going to trade out? Were they going to even be able to get understandable compensation for moving out of that pick? And who was going to trade up to that spot? Well, no one ended up going with that. And Marvin Harrison Jr. ends up getting taken number 4 overall and is headed to Arizona. Of course, the Los Angeles Chargers, now that Jim Harbaugh is there, we know that he likes offensive line, but you had seen what they had done over the offseason and them trading away Keenan Allen, letting Mike Williams walk in free agency and go to the New York Jets. You have Quentin Johnson, who you took with your first-round pick last year, but he was less than stellar in his rookie year, so maybe a lot of people were thinking, okay, well, if Marvin's not going to be there for you at 5 and you don't trade down, how about you take Malik Neighbors out of LSU? 2 LSU guys taken in the top 5. That did not happen. They went with Joe Alt out of Notre Dame, which is completely understandable. Of course, like I just mentioned, Jim Harbaugh, he's really predicated on making sure that he has good offensive line, and we had seen that it has been porous since Justin Herbert has gone into the league, into the NFL. He has had suboptimal offensive line play. So the fact that you got the number 1 offensive lineman in this draft to help bolster that, and as well as make sure that you have the running game that you have been building around throughout the offseason, is able to be as good as you hope to, and you put less pressure on Justin Herbert. It made sense because there was also a report going out throughout the offseason of they already had Joe Alt Chargers jerseys going on at the team store that you could buy, which is crazy to think. But I mean, in late February, early March, it's a crazy report to go out there, especially since you had another month and a half before we get to that point where you could actually realistically have that as an option. But it makes the most sense. You look at how they had attacked the offseason. They weren't really getting wide receivers in free agency. They were letting them go, and they were getting a bunch of running backs, and they signed a bunch of tight ends, blocking tight ends to be specific. They got Will Dissly. They had signed J.K. Dobbins. They signed Gus Edwards. They let Austin Eckler walk. Like it was going more towards of a I formation, two tight end sets type of situation where you're going to be running the ball more often, and Justin Herbert's probably maybe going to be under center more often. But even if not, with your two tight end sets, you can still run a single back formation and have him in shotgun, but you're putting less pressure on Justin Herbert. I really liked it. Malik Neighbors ends up going number 6. And then at number 7, the Tennessee Titans, they weren't able to get Joe Alt since he was taken number 5 by the Chargers. They went with the next best guy that was on their board offensive tackle-wise, and they went with J.C. Latham out of Alabama. And it makes a lot of sense. He had been rising up on boards over the last couple of weeks before we got to the NFL draft, and it's completely fair. He looked really good at Alabama when he was with the Crimson Tide and with Nick Saban. And it really comes down to you need to be able to replace Taylor Lewan. That offensive line hasn't looked good as it has in previous years. And even though you don't have Derrick Henry, you still have Tony Pollard. You still have Tajay Spears. You still have a triple threat at receiver in their receiving core. And then you still want to make sure that you are able to protect Will Levis, whether he is going to be your franchise quarterback for the future or not. You still want to be able to give him a fair chance. And having J.C. Latham on that offensive line, that should be able to help. And then you look at number 8, the Atlanta Falcons. This was the big shocker in the draft because they ended up taking quarterback Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington, which Michael Penix Jr., a lot of people thought he could go in the second round. Maybe the Las Vegas Raiders take him there early on, or maybe they end up taking him with the number 13 overall selection. Atlanta said, no. We're going to get our guy. But it's really interesting because even though there may be injury concerns with Penix, I'm not really worried about it because he's been healthy the last 2 years and he's been an absolute phenomenal passer and he looks league ready in my eyes. Not completely league ready, but I mean, compared to a lot of other quarterbacks, he should be able to translate pretty well to the NFL. You already signed Kirk Cousins earlier in the offseason, and it's going to be really difficult to move off from him before the end of that third year of that 4-year contract that Kirk Cousins signed with you earlier in the offseason. So it's really difficult. Plus, Penix is already 23. He's going to be turning 24 soon. So he probably, under our assumption, he wouldn't be starting his first NFL games or be the full-time starter once Kirk Cousins potentially leaves until the age of 27, which isn't the most optimal. I know that Jordan Love, he sat 3 years behind Aaron Rodgers, but Jordan Love was 20, 21 years old, so he was able to get his first start once he was 24, 25. It's a little bit different once you get to 27, but I think there is a way that you could be able to move on from Kirk Cousins before that third year is over. I think by the end of the second year, you could see something going on, depending on what happens with the performance of Kirk Cousins. Maybe Michael Penix Jr. is a lot more advanced than maybe we anticipated. Once he gets along and gets a hold of that offense for the Falcons, you probably could see him play a good bit of time once we get into 2025. Now, of course, Rome Odunze, he ends up going number 9 overall to the Chicago Bears, giving them another weapon for Caleb Williams to throw to. And then J.J. McCarthy, a lot of people thought, and even for me, I was convinced that they were going to go number 4, number 5. The Vikings were going to be able to trade up to that point with either the Cardinals or the Chargers to be able to go get J.J. McCarthy. Well, they traded from 11 to 10 with the New York Jets to be able to get him. So they still ended up getting their quarterback, and they didn't have to trade up as high as we anticipated for them to go to. Now, of course, for the New Orleans Saints, I'm going to skip a couple of guys. Of course, Bo Nix, he ended up going to the Denver Broncos, number 12. That one, it felt like that one was going to happen, even though a lot of people had a second-round grade on him. Teams usually take a quarterback higher than maybe they should, just because if you can make that turnaround, like we saw with the Houston Texans and C.J. Stroud, if you can get your guy, it doesn't matter where you get him, even if you overpay. If you can make that turnaround, people forget when that quarterback was taken. But for the New Orleans Saints, they ended up taking Talise Fuaga out of Oregon State. We had talked about it with Ross Jackson. We talked about it over the offseason. It felt like it was going to be one of those 3 Fs. Olu Fashanu out of Penn State, Troy Fatanu out of Washington, or Talise Fuaga out of Oregon State. They really had their pick of the litter. I know Olu Fashanu ended up getting taken by the Jets at number 11, so it really came down to two Fs once we got down to number 14 overall. And they decided to take their guy, Talise Fuaga, and looking back at some of the tape, he's looking like a really sturdy offensive tackle that could be an anchor for you for years to come that can hopefully turn around that run game and turn around that offense for the New Orleans Saints. Now, of course, skipping all the way to number 23, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they traded down from 17 all the way to 23. And even though they made a couple of signings early on in the offseason, getting guys like Gabe Davis and Devin Duvernay, they did move on from Calvin Ridley. They really needed an X receiver that they could go to consistently for Trevor Lawrence on the outside. They didn't really have one of those. I mean, you have Christian Kirk in the slot. You have Gabe Davis, who's probably going to be more of a Y or a Z receiver on the outside to be a flanker. But you needed an X receiver that Trevor Lawrence could go to consistently and be a trustworthy target. And that was Brian Thomas Jr. And it made all the sense once it came down to it. Brian Thomas, he looked really good at LSU, and he exploded in 2023-2024 season with the Tigers. He looked really good. And I feel like actually, as I looked through it, that one was probably one of the better scenarios. I know other teams were kind of mocked towards Brian Thomas, but Jacksonville with the young quarterback, the other good weapons on the outside and in the slot, plus you have Trevor Etienne and Evan Ingram at running back at tight end. This offense is looking pretty good. I know a lot of Jags fans wanted a corner because it's looking pretty poor there, but if you're looking at the rest of the AFC, I had talked about counter picking and taking a corner, just like how I said the Indianapolis Colts should do, even though they took an edge rusher. It still made sense, and I think being able to get a trustworthy target on the outside for Trevor Lawrence, that could make a big difference compared to them maybe winning and losing, or at least being in contention in the AFC South. Now, of course, there were a couple of receivers that went late in the first round that maybe we weren't expecting. I know that we thought A.D. Mitchell was going to go in the first round. He ended up going in the second to the Indianapolis Colts, so they were still able to get another receiver. But Ricky Pearsall, that one was interesting. The fact that he ended up going number 31 overall to the San Francisco 49ers. That one's really interesting because we thought either Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk was going to get traded on draft night. That did not happen. They currently have Deebo, Ayuk, and Ricky Pearsall as their three main receivers, plus they still have Juwan Johnson at the moment. So the receiving core is looking pretty loaded out there in the Bay Area. We could see we could still see the trade going on in the future, but as of right now, that's what it's looking like. I'd probably say if you had to trade one of the two, I feel like you would trade Deebo. I know that a lot of people were talking about Brandon Ayuk being traded, but I feel like if you had to trade one of the two and you had to move on from someone, I know that Brandon Ayuk, you need to be able to make an extension soon. You also have to make an extension with Brock Purdy. You're not going to be able to sign everyone. So if you're able to get something done, I think you're going to have to move on from one of those two receivers. And I wonder if it's going to be Deebo of the two main guys out there in San Francisco that gets dealt. And then Xavier Legette, the Carolina Panthers traded with the Buffalo Bills, who were previously traded back to number 32 with the Kansas City Chiefs as they took Xavier Worthy out of Texas. Xavier Legette, that was another guy where I thought he was going to be a day two guy, either in the second, maybe the third round. He actually gets taken number 32 overall and is at the tail end of the first round. Maybe he's a guy that's actually going to be able to step up for Bryce Young because the last couple of receivers that they've taken, it has not worked out. Jonathan Mingo has not worked out so far. Terrace Marshall Jr. out of LSU, he hasn't worked out. Adam Thielen, he's only getting older. So you got to keep taking shots at receivers. I know that the offensive line, the rest of that team needs a lot of help, but if you can give another weapon that's actually reliable that you can pair with a young quarterback in Bryce Young, that might be something to look out for the future, especially since that defense already looks pretty good. Now, of course, like I had talked about, going into the second round, I'm not going to get into too much detail when it comes to the second, third, fourth, and beyond of the NFL draft, but I was able to go to Keon Coleman's draft party. Of course, he is a local product here in St. Landry Parish. It was really cool to meet him, meet his family, meet his friends, and The Buffalo Bills ended up taking him with the first pick in day 2, number 33 overall. Keon Coleman is able to replace Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis out there in Buffalo and give a nice X receiver, a big body receiver, to Josh Allen to throw to out there in the cold. I think it's a match made in heaven. Keon Coleman, he looked really good at Michigan State, and then he looked really, really good in Florida State when he was with the Seminoles last year. And it makes so much sense because you have now Dalton Kincaid at tight end. You have James Cook, who looks really good from the 20 to 20 range on the field at running back for you. Josh Allen, we already know, is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And now you have an outside receiver that's really young in Keon Coleman that feels like he is a trustworthy target that really wants to work with Josh Allen, wants to get better, be the best player that he can absolutely be. This just feels like a match made in heaven, and I am all for this pick. Now, of course, with the guys that rose, there were a couple of guys that fell. And one guy that I want to talk about before we wrap up this edition of Cleats and Sneaks, it's another New Orleans Saint, and Spencer Rattler. We anticipated him early on in his college career. We said he was going to be the number 1 overall pick in whichever draft he declares for. Well, that didn't happen. It didn't look too good in his time at Oklahoma. That's why he had to transfer to South Carolina. And then in South Carolina, it wasn't the most consistent quarterback play that you maybe were hoping for from the former 5-star prospect. But as you went along, you thought, okay, maybe he'll probably be a day 2 guy, whether he goes in the 2nd or the 3rd round. He didn't go in day 2. He actually didn't even go in the 4th round. He didn't go till pick 15 in the 5th round by the New Orleans Saints. And that was the biggest gap that threw me off, was we saw Bo Nix get taken number 12 overall. That was the 6th quarterback in the first 12 picks of the NFL draft. We had not seen that really ever or for a while. And the first 14 picks were all offense. That's kind of a sign that you can see of what's going on with the NFL, and that's probably a trend that we can lean towards in future drafts. But from that pick with Bo Nix to Denver up until Spencer Rattler going to the Saints, that was a huge gap going from the last quarterback taken to the next quarterback taken. And Spencer Rattler, to me, that's a huge value deal because even though he's got the arm, you are kind of curious what is going on mentally, because a lot of teams, even though I'm not sure you can totally buy this, but they were saying that the excuse of him having not the greatest image back when he was in high school, when he was doing that show for high school quarterbacks, I agree. It did not look good, but I don't think that something from 2019 should hold a kid back from being a day 2 pick and going all the way to the 5th round. Nevertheless, I feel like this is an absolute great pick by the New Orleans Saints. Is it going to work out? I'm not going to say Spencer Rattler is all of a sudden going to become the 2nd greatest quarterback in New Orleans Saints history behind Drew Brees. But I think it's a good shot to take because when it comes to once you get into that 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round, it really comes down to value. Who are some guys that maybe are falling that are really good talent-wise and that are guys that you could work with and be developmental pieces? Those are shots that you should be able to take. And the fact that you already have the arm talent in Spencer Rattler, if you can get him to work in Clint Kubiak's system once Derek Carr leaves and he is given his shot and he's able to run away with it, I feel like this would be an absolute steal. We know that not many 5th, 6th, 7th round picks ever really work out for the most part and ever become gems like we see with either George Kittle or Jason Kelce or even Marcus Colston. Even if it doesn't work out, I feel like it's a really good shot that you should be able to take. That's going to do it for this edition of Cleats and Sneaks. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, ESPN Southwest Louisiana. We also cover plenty of our local teams, the LSU Tigers, the Houston Astros, the Louisiana Raging Cajuns, of course, those New Orleans Saints, and even those New Orleans Pelicans. I know that they got eliminated and they got swept in their 1st round matchup in the NBA playoffs against the Oklahoma City Thunder. Big offseason to come. Here and there's going to be quite a bit of change potentially from GM David Griffin. We're going to talk about that and the NBA playoffs as a whole, talk about what's already happened, what's going to happen next week when it comes to the next round of the playoffs. But until then, I'm James Meche. Appreciate you listening in, and I'll talk to you next week.